Okay, we'll start with homage, homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. And today is May 18th, 2003. Okay, welcome back everybody who's coming back after a long time. I think we had our last class was middle of December, so it's been about 5 months. Okay, we are continuing with the reading of the Majjhima Nikāya, and now we are into the chapter called the Brahmana Vagga, the chapter dealing with the Brahmins, and we're about to start on Sutta number 95. This is called the Canki Sutta. It's a discourse focused around or involving a Brahmin by the name of Canki. And if you don't know the Pali alphabet and you look at the spelling, you don't know how to pronounce this. You think it might be Canki. But the C in Pali is always pronounced like CH, like Ch in church. And so this is like, there's a kind of, what is that, peanut butter company? They have this two kinds of peanut butter, smooth, and the other kind is chunky. Skippy peanut butter, yeah. They have smooth or chunky. So this is pronounced chunky. Okay, so the sutta begins when the Buddha has been wandering in the state of Kosala with a large community of monks, and eventually he arrives at a Brahmin village, apparently a village dominated by the Brahmins, named Upasada, and he goes to stay there in a certain grove to the north of the town. It's called the Solitary Grove. Okay, and then the text explains that on that occasion, the Brahmin named Canki was ruling over Upasada, which is a crown property that had been abounding in living beings, probably deer and rabbits and other animals, rich in grasslands, woodlands, waterways, and grain. And this was a royal endowment given to him by King Pasenadi of Kosala. So Pasenadi was the king of Kosala, and Pasenadi was also a devoted lay disciple of the Buddha. And if familiar with the text, you know that the Buddha also had his main monastery in the capital of the state of Kosala, the capital of Savatthi. Okay, so the text continues and it says that the Brahmin householders of Upasada heard that the recluse Gautama, who is reputed to be an arahat, perfectly enlightened, and so on, is now dwelling at Upasada, and so they decide to go to see him. And so we have this scene where the Brahmin householders of Upasada have set out in groups, and they're going to the north of the city towards the grove where the Buddha is staying. Okay, now the text continues and tells us that the brahmin Canki, at the time when all the people are going up to the north to see the Buddha, the brahmin Canki had retired to the upper story of his palace for his midday rest. And then he sees the brahmin householders moving up to the north, and then he inquires from one of his attendants, his minister, he says, "Why are so many of these brahmin householders setting out from the town and moving north in the direction of the solitary grove?" And then his attendant explains to him that the ascetic Gautama, whom they call the Buddha, is now staying temporarily in that grove to the north of the city, or the north of the town, and so they're all going to see the Master Gautama. Okay, so then apparently you could see a certain relationship here, that all of the Brahmin householders who are going to see the Buddha are probably just ordinary people. You know, maybe even though they're from the Brahmin class, but they're probably just what we would call working class folk, people who just perform the routine Brahmin duties. Or maybe even they're just ordinary householders who are presided over by particular Brahmins. But the Brahmin Canki appears to be what we would call upper class, so a very high-ranking Brahmin. And he is said to live in a mansion or a palace. He has attendants, and apparently he doesn't know everything that's going on, whereas the ordinary Brahmins are sort of hipper to what's going on in the town. Okay, so the Brahmin Canki, when he finds out that this great ascetic called the Buddha is living close to the town, he sends a message down. He asks his minister to go and tell the other Brahmin householders that I too want to go see the recluse Gautama. Okay, now the text tells us, we go over to the next page, that on this occasion, 500 Brahmins from various states were staying at Uposatha on some business. And now we have to be a little careful with the text when we come across the number 500, because it's always used in the text as just a way of representing a fairly large number. So we can't always believe that when the text uses the number 500, that it means that if you were to go counting, you would find that there were 500 Brahmins staying there. Like if, 1,000 years from now, when it said that Bhikkhu Bodhi was giving a class on the Majjhima Nikāya at Twangan Monastery, it says, on that occasion, Bhikkhu Bodhi was teaching the Majjhima Nikāya to 500 students. And somebody had a photograph and was checking to say, where are they all hiding? Maybe they're hiding some of these students who are there, or have other students hidden in their pockets. Okay, so 500 just means, a fairly large number. Okay, and apparently these Brahmins who had come to Uposatha must also have been high-ranking Brahmins. First, because apparently they're not going to see the Buddha, and then we'll see the other reason why we can infer that they were high-ranking from the argument that they're going to use against Canki. Okay, so these Brahmins have heard that this brahmin Canki, who seems to be one of their own rank, very high-grade brahmin, is going to see the recluse Gautama. And so they must have been disheartened, even shocked about this, and they come to the Buddha in order to dissuade him from going. And now from the text, we know that we can infer that the relationship between the Brahmins and the Buddhists, the Buddha and his own followers, was not always smooth and harmonious. From some of the very recent studies that have been done on Indian culture, it's now been determined that we can't say that Indian culture of this period was uniform and homogeneous, but rather there seem to have been two main pockets of Indian culture in this period. One was centered or based in central India, the area which now corresponds to Delhi. It's the area which was called the Kuru country of that time. And in that area, the Brahmins were dominant, and Brahmin culture prevailed. But in the northeast, particularly the state of Magadha, where the Buddha often resided, a kind of different culture was prevailed. A culture in which it seems the Kshatriyas, that is, the aristocrats, the rulers, the warriors, the administrators, were the dominant community. And in that culture, the sort of main religious inspiration came from the Shamanas, the wandering ascetics, amongst whom the Buddha was a member. And now the Brahmin culture from the central India was spreading out to the east, trying to take over, to infiltrate and dominate the Shramana-based culture of eastern India. And so when the Brahmins speak about the Shramanas, the wandering ascetics, they often speak about them in denigrating terms. They sometimes call them mundaka, which we might translate as baldy heads, or shramanaka, like little ascetics. And they disparage them primarily because they reject the authority of the Vedas, the sacred text of the Brahmins, and they don't acknowledge the superiority of the Brahmins. And yet the Buddha was very diplomatic, we could say, in his dealings with the Brahmins. On the one hand, he rejected some of the main claims of the Brahmins. He didn't recognize the authority of the Vedas. He didn't recognize the superiority of the Brahmins. He didn't agree that people of different social classes had different spiritual capacities. But on the other hand, he seemed to know or to realize that the Brahmins played an important role in Indian culture, and so he wanted to accommodate them without acceding to the claims, the Brahmin claims, that he himself rejected. Okay, so in some texts, we see the Buddha taking the word Brahmin and then investing it with a new meaning, a meaning which is perhaps intended to capture the original significance of the word Brahmin. The word Brahmin comes from the word Brahma, which has a sense of pure and holy. So Brahma is the pure and holy spirit, and the Brahmins are seen to be the ones who maintain and transmit the pure and holy spirit. But the Brahmins in the Buddha's time had become hungry for wealth and power, pretentious in their claims to superiority. So the Buddha wanted to recapture the original significance of Brahman as one who embodies holiness and purity. And so in some suttas, he virtually redefines the Brahman as the Arhat. And so anybody who becomes purified spiritually and holy by reason of his spiritual accomplishments becomes the true Brahman, not the one who's born in a certain social class. And then in other suttas, we see the Buddha criticizing the conduct of the Brahmins of that period, particularly there's some suttas in the Anguttara Nikāya, Book of the Fives. I think it's around 180, 83, 84, 183, 184, 185, where the text is actually rather cutting in its sarcasm. It compares the Brahmins to dogs, and it points out how in their behavior, the dogs are superior. Do we have any Brahmins here? I don't want anybody to get up and walk out. So speak about how in some respects the dogs are superior to the Brahmins in their behavior. Like it says the dogs have sexual relations. The male dog has a sexual relation with the female dog only when the female dog is in season, but not at other times. Whereas the Brahmins have sexual relations at any time. And I think it says that it says that the dogs when they get hungry, then they go to the village to beg for food. And they eat what they want, and then they go back to their homes. They don't store up any food. But the Brahmins go begging for food, and then they get much more food than they need, then they go back and they store up their food. Okay, so we see other texts in which the Buddha is very critical of the Brahmins. And we see in this text that the Buddha is going to use a kind of middle way approach of, trying to speak politely, courteously to the Brahmins, but also to criticize them on certain key claims that the Brahmins have about their own teaching. And what strikes me interesting about this passage, well, maybe we go through the passage, then I'll bring up this interesting point. Okay, we're coming back now to this situation where the visiting Brahmins from out of state have heard that Canki, their colleague, is planning to go up to the north to see the Buddha. And so they come to him, they ask him whether it's true, he says that it's true, And now they're going to start with a long argument trying to convince Canki not to go see the Buddha. But rather they're going to argue that there are other reasons why the Buddha should come to see you. And in coming to see, it means not just to visit, but in a sense to pay respects. Okay, so the Brahmins launch into their argument. I'm in section 8 now, so that they say, do not go to see the recluse Gotama. It isn't proper for you to go see the recluse Gotama. Rather, Gotama should come to see you. And now he's giving the reasons. For you, sir, are well born on both sides of pure maternal and paternal descent, 7 generations back, unassailable and impeccable in respect of birth. And you see, the Brahmins, they give a lot of attention to family background. In order to be worthy of respect, you have to come from, in their view, to have parents, mother and father, who are both unadulterated Brahmins going back at least 7 generations. Okay, so this is, we say, the first reason, the reason based upon birth or family lineage. The second reason, you, sir, are rich with great wealth and great possessions. So, the Brahmin viewpoint is almost quite materialistic. Whoever has the most wealth is the most worthy of respect. Whereas originally the Brahmins were to be living lives of partial renunciation, and it's still a value cherished by the Brahmins. But the Brahmins, because they maintained the Vedas, the sacred texts of ancient India, and the recitation of the performance of the Vedic rituals was considered essential for maintaining the order of the cosmos. So the kings and rulers, what they would have the regular ceremonies performed in their states in order to, in their view, to preserve the well-being of the nation. And they had to rely on the Brahmins and invite the Brahmins to perform the sacred rituals. And in return, everything is based on exchange. So in return for the performance of the rituals, the kings and other aristocrats would give money, land, and cattle and other benefits to the Brahmins. And so the Brahmins could become very rich, wealthy landowners. Okay, so we would say a second argument or an important value of the Brahmins is wealth. The third argument is based on learning or knowledge. So you, sir, are a master of the 3 Vedas with their vocabularies, liturgy, phonology, etymology, and the histories as a 5th. You are skilled in philology and grammar, fully versed in natural philosophy, and in the marks of a great man. So these are the ancillaries or secondary branches of Brahminic learning. The main part is the 3 Vedas, and then there are other parts that the Brahmins are expected to learn. Okay, the next argument is based on physical attractiveness, physical comeliness, appearance. So you, sir, are handsome, comely, and graceful, possessing supreme beauty of complexion, with sublime beauty and sublime presence, remarkable to behold. Seems a little puzzling to see a Brahmin praised as though he were a beauty queen. But this is one of the arguments used. Okay, then the next one, the fifth ground, is virtue. So you, sir, are virtuous, mature in virtue, possessing mature virtue. The next argument is based on eloquence. You, sir, are a good speaker with a good delivery. You speak words that are courteous, distinct, flawless, and convey the meaning. Then the next is related to status as a teacher. You teach the teachers of many. So he's a very prominent, eminent teacher. I find it a little puzzling if he's teaching the teachers of many, like he's an elder generation teacher. So under him there are with the other Brahmins who are now teachers of their own groups of pupils. So if he's maybe 60, you would speculate he might be 65, 70 years old. So how do one praise him as being so beautiful and handsome and competent? Maybe I could get there too. Okay, so he teaches the teachers of many. And then the next argument is based on, you would say, esteem and honor. So you are honored, respected, revered, venerated, and esteemed by King Pasenadi of Kosala, by another elder Brahmin named Pokarasati. Okay, so this is based on esteem. And then the next argument is based on property. This is related to the possession of wealth. So you rule over Upasada, the crown property given to you by King Pasenadi of Kosala. So for all of these reasons, you shouldn't go to see the recluse Gautama, but the recluse Gautama should come to see you. So if we look at these reasons, we could say that some are superficial and some might be like authentic religious or spiritual values. Let's go through them. Birth or family lineage, would that be spiritual or superficial? Yeah, superficial. Wealth? Superficial. I should hope so. Learning? It seems learning could be a middle ground, depending on whether it's just, intellectual knowledge or whether it's used. Physical beauty? Superficial. Okay. Virtue? Virtuous conduct? Okay, so that's genuinely spiritual. Eloquence and speaking? It's, middle ground. It could swing either way. Okay, having a lot of students. I think that could swing either way. Being honored, revered, respected. Yeah, it seems it could go either way. But let's say there's nothing intrinsic in that, but it depends on what one is being revered and respected for. And then property, having crown properties. Spiritual or superficial? Okay, superficial. Okay, so the visiting Brahmins give all of these arguments why the Buddha should come to see Canki. But now Canki, the Brahmin Canki, replies to the Brahmins, and he says, now listen to me. why it isn't proper, why it's proper for me to go see Master Gotama, it's the Buddha, and why Master Gotama shouldn't come to see me. Okay, since Canki is a Brahmin, he's going to consent to some of the Brahminic arguments. So he says the recluse Gotama is well born on both sides of pure descent, maternal and paternal through 7 generations. So the Buddha isn't a Brahmin, but he's from a pure Kshatriya descent. And so the Brahmins, even though they claim to be superior to the Kshatriyas, but they still had a high regard for the Kshatriyas. Okay, so this is the first reason. Okay, now, and that's something that both the Brahmins and the Buddha have in common, pure family lineage. But now comes a difference. The recluse Gotama went forth abandoning much gold and bullion, stored away in vaults and in lofts. So now, what is the virtue that's being praised here in the Buddha? In one word. Speak up. Exactly, renunciation. But, if he just was living an ordinary, just like an ordinary householder with maybe a house, a little plot of land, struggling by on a moderate income, and he renounced nothing special, but he comes from a very wealthy, aristocratic family, even according to legend, the son of a king. So he gave up much gold and wealth stored away. Okay, next, the recluse Gotama went forth into homelessness while still young, a black-haired young man endowed with the blessing of youth in the prime of life. So again, this is renunciation, but here, what's being indicated is, you see, amongst the Brahmins, or at least in theory, there was a kind of theory that the Brahmin should study, was a teacher, up till the age of 24. At the age of 24, he leaves his teacher. Then he has the option, which almost all took with a few exceptions, to marry and start a family from the age 24 to the age, I think, of 48. They live the family life. Then at 48, one becomes what's called the vanaprastha. One sets out for the woods. That is, one could go with one's wife. The children now go off. They're on their own. And one lives a very simple life on the edge of the woods, devoting oneself to more religious study and more religious practices from 48 until 62, something like that. Then at the age of 62 or so, or 64, then one gives up everything and becomes what they call sannyasi or paribhajika, a wandering ascetic. So, the idea is that when you get to be old, that's the time for renunciation. But when you're a young man in the prime of life, you don't think of renunciation, but you think of first, well, you study, and after finishing your studies, then you get married, have kids, and as a Brahmin, you would perform the Brahminic services. Of course, even amongst the Brahmins, very, very few passed the second stage and went on to the third and fourth stage, the stage of partial renunciation and complete renunciation. Rather, they just continued to live as householders. So the fact that the ascetic Gotama, at the age of 29, gave up the household life, in the prime of life to become an ascetic. That's something that at least this Brahmin, Canki, admires. Okay, and then when the recluse Gautama went forth into homelessness, he did so while it says his mother and father wished otherwise and wept with tearful faces. Sometimes this makes one a little sad. And people can say, especially also the Buddha had a wife and child. So we say, how can he do that? But because he came from a wealthy family, that the wife and child were well provided for, and his father and his foster mother, they were also well off. So he was not abandoning them to the risk of indigence. Again, so all of these are illustrating the strength of his renunciation. Okay, going on now. Again, we have the appeal to beauty. The recluse Gautama is handsome, comely, graceful, etc., possessing sublime beauty and presence, remarkable to behold. So, we read that the Buddha had what's called the 32 marks of the great man. And sometimes if we read these 32 marks and think that a human being or a person that would have these 32 marks must barely look like a human being. But in fact, the way I would see them, they must have been very subtle, and maybe some of them are exaggerated in the text, but when you put them all together, they must have enhanced the person's physical beauty. Because I think it's one of the principles that the Buddha, all the Buddhas are supposed to have physical beauty as a way of attracting ordinary people who base their judgments on physical appearances. Not that the Buddha is trying to attract, women like a movie actor or a rock star or sports star, or trying to attract, gay men who might be attracted to him, but rather, people base their opinions or assessments to some extent on physical appearances. So the Buddha cultivates these virtues which will come to fruition in a beautiful appearance as a way of attracting beings. Okay, so this is the argument based on virtue. Next is the argument based on skill, on eloquence, skill as a speaker, that the recluse Gautama is a good speaker with good delivery, and so on. Then comes the argument based on his entourage of students, that he's the teacher of the teachers of many. So these are things that the Buddha has in common with the Brahmins. And then comes an argument that certainly goes against the Brahmins, that the recluse Gautama is free from sensual lust and without personal vanity. So these are qualities that the Brahmins themselves didn't have, because the Brahmins did marry and raise families, so they had sensual desire. And some of them, according to the Buddhist texts that are critical of the Brahmins, point out how the Brahmins were not even satisfied. I think this comes maybe in the sutta about the dogs, so I might be wrong about this, but I think the argument goes that when a dog takes a partner dog, it remains faithful to the partner dog. But now the Brahmins can't even remain faithful to their own wife, but they have to get many concubines as well. Okay, then comes an argument which it seems is intended to, in two parts, to ensure the Brahmins that they're safe with the Buddha, but the Buddha is not the danger to them. First is that the recluse Gotama upholds the doctrine of karma, the doctrine of Kirya. He's a Kamavada, Kiryavada. That is, he acknowledges the law of moral causation, that good and bad karmic deeds will produce their desirable, undesirable results. The Brahmins were very firm in upholding the law of karma, and they had to contend with a number of sects of wanderers who challenged and denied the law of karma. We meet some of them in the Majjhima Nikāya who said that there's no good, no bad, there's no retribution for good and bad deeds. And so the Brahmins might have been afraid of teachers like that. So the Brahmin Canki wants to assure his colleagues that the Buddha is not going to undermine the teaching of karma. And so he also says, and the second part is that the Buddha doesn't seek any harm for the lineage of the Brahmins. Okay, then the next few arguments just seem to, I suspect that these are just interpolations, the next few sentences into the text, because they just restate the same point stated earlier, that the recluse Gotama comes from an aristocratic family, from a rich family. Okay, but now comes the argument based on honor and respect from others, that many people come from remote regions to question the recluse Gotama. Many thousands of deities have gone for refuge, for life to the recluse Gotama. A good report has spread about him. And then the recluse Gotama possesses the 32 marks of a great man. Then King Bimbisara has gone for refuge to the recluse Gotama. King Pasenadi has gone for refuge to him. Brahmin Pokarasati has gone for refuge to him. Okay, and so he piles on all of these arguments, and then he uses finally an argument based on simple courtesy. Here I'm at the top of page 778. The recluse Gotama has arrived in Upasada and he's living to the north of the town. Now, any recluses or Brahmins that come to our town are our guests, and guests should be honored, respected, revered, and venerated by us. This is a very firm principle in Indian culture, that they say that the guest to your home should be regarded as a deva, like a god, and should be treated with kindness, consideration, hospitality. And we say, like, what's mine is yours. But we have to be careful. Certain guests will say, okay, you say what is yours is mine, get out, I'm taking over your house. There's a Chinese saying that I heard, it's easier to invite the gods to your home than it is to get rid of them. Okay, so first, Canki is laying down this general principle, and then he's applying it to the specific case. Since the recluse Gotama has arrived here at Upasada, and he's staying, because Brahmin Canki is sort of the master of this whole town with its surrounding, with its environs. So he's saying, the Buddha is our guest, And so we should respect him, revere him, and venerate him. So for all of these reasons, it's proper for me to go see him. He shouldn't have to come to see me. Okay, then the Brahmin Canki adds another few sentences which are going to build up and intensify his praise of the Buddha. He says, "This much is the praise of Master Gotama that I have heard or learned, but the praise of Master Gotama is not limited to that. For the praise of Master Gotama is immeasurable. And since Master Gotama possesses each one of these factors, it's not proper for him to come to see me, but rather it's proper for me to go to see him. And therefore, let's all of us go to see the recluse Gotama." And so thereupon the Brahmin Canki, together with all of his visiting Brahmins, they all went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. Okay, in the rest of the sutta is called the Canki Sutta. But if you've read the rest of the sutta, you see that the Brahmin Canki is not really mentioned. He just is mentioned on one occasion, but for the rest he just drops out of the sutta. And so this raises, in my mind, a little suspicion. Maybe I'll see if anybody can guess what I'm driving out about this first part of the sutta. Something seemed a little bit suspicious about, let's say, its historical authenticity.
Yeah, I had wondered how this bit with Canki had lasted over hundreds of years because neither Ananda nor the Buddha were there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the point that I had in mind. You could raise the question, how would the compilers of the suttas have been privy to this conversation? They weren't there. Somebody might argue, okay, maybe Moggallana, who has his psychic powers, happened to tune his divine ear in and was listening. And then Moggallana told somebody else, because Moggallana passed away a little before the Buddha, so he wasn't present at the first council when the texts were being recited. And nothing is said about Moggallana listening in. So how was this conversation? We could say, okay, the Buddha was omniscient. He might have been listening in and told it to the monks. But I think the Buddha would have more important things to attend to than to listen to such conversations. So where did the conversation, how did it get into the text?
Unless it was mentioned in the text.
Wait, take the microphone.
Unless it was mentioned by Canki at that time to other people.
The Canki would have told others, who would have told the monks. Yeah, I don't know. It seems a little bit that strains my credulity. Excuse me?
That's what I can think of.
Yeah, but it seems.
How I came here today.
It's also, it's possible that Canki might have related to somebody, something about a discussion that took place. But each of these arguments.
What happened to Canki later on?
Nothing is said anyplace else in the text about him. I don't think he reappears in any other suttas. Anyway, so this is a question that I bring up. It seems to me that, we can see this conversation as having what I would call a strategic purpose. on the one hand, showing how trying to establish a harmonious accord between the Brahmins and the Buddhist community, because it shows that certain qualities that the Brahmins are praised for, the Buddha also possesses. Good family lineage, physical beauty, eloquence in speaking, a large following. And then also emphasizing that the Buddha upholds the law of karma and intends no harm for the Brahmins. So on the one hand, it's attempting to, placate the Brahmin community and say, we can get along harmoniously. Don't have to worry that we're going to be, challenging you. But on the other hand, it's also showing that the Buddha, in certain respects, is superior spiritually to the Brahmins, because the Buddha has renunciation, the virtue of renunciation. He's free of sensual lusts, and whereas the Brahmin Canki is honored and respected by King Pasenadi and other high-ranking rulers of the time. The King Pasenadi and King Bimbisara, together with their families, have gone for refuge to the Buddha. Okay, so all of this is, I would say, very important. Exercising a kind of strategic function in sort of balancing cordial relations with the Brahmins with a firm line of the spiritual superiority of the Buddha. Any questions or comments at this point?
I have a comment.
Please take the mobile microphone.
Even though exactly someone like Canki may not exist or historically be correct,
yeah.
The conversation seems very true at that time.
The what?
The conversation.
Conversation.
Seems to represent the truth, like a lot of Brahmins have complaints against the Buddhists, and
yeah.
Perhaps one Brahmin such as Canki
yeah.
said the right thing.
Yeah,
seems historically, conceptually correct.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Even though this might not be
exactly right.
An actual historical conversation, but it can be like an imaginary reconstruction of the type of conversation that would have taken place.
Yes, that's what I think. Thank you.
I think Michael,
yes.
Take the microphone first.
Of course. I notice also that coming up very quickly is setting up the legitimacy of the young upstart Brahmin. And the young, whose name I can't pronounce.
Yeah, his name is Kapatika.
And it's Canki who sets up the legitimacy of this.
That's a very good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. In fact, that seems to be the only place, once they come into the presence of the Buddha, it's the only place where Canki, that's the only place further on in the sutta where Canki speaks. So it seems like the whole preliminary portion of the sutta could be, as you say, for the purpose of introducing Canki as an authoritative Brahmin, so that he will then throw the weight of his authority behind this young Brahmin student named Kapatika. Did I see somebody else have? Okay, so let us go continue then into the rest of the sutta. Okay, so now this whole, see this whole first, the large crowd of ordinary, householder Brahmins has already gone into the Buddha's presence, and now this fairly large group, perhaps 500, we don't know, of eminent Brahmins, distinguished Brahmins, headed by Canki, has now gone up to the north to see the Buddha. And so, after they exchanged the courteous greetings, so we read that on that occasion, the Blessed One was seated, finishing some amiable talk with some very senior Brahmins. So apparently there were already distinguished Brahmins who were up there speaking with the Buddha. And then we read, is that a telephone? Excuse me? Oh, okay. So at the time in the assembly there was a Brahmin student named Kappatika. I don't think we encounter him anyplace else, only in the sutta. But apparently at the time there must have been these young proteges, like a Mozart at the age of 5 was able to compose beautiful compositions, give concerts, at the age of 10, 11. So there were these young Brahmins who were just 16, not even, they called Manavaka, I think, a Brahmin student. But even though he was so young, he had mastered the 3 Vedas and their vocabularies and so on. So he mastered all of the branches of Brahmin learning. And so while the elder Brahmins were talking with the Buddha, this youngster was always trying to break in and interrupt their talk. And so the Buddha rebukes him. And he says, let not the venerable, the word here, venerable, it's not the same word as venerable used for a monk. I think it's more like honorable. Bharadvaja, that would be his family name, whereas Kappatika would have been his personal name. And the Bharadvajas, this was like the cream of the ultra elite amongst the Brahmins. Like, today when they speak about the U.S. economy, sometimes they speak about the 1%, and then they speak about the 1/10 of the 1%. So the Bharadvajas were like the 1/10 of the 1% amongst the Brahmins. So coming from that particular clan, he must have been Kappatika, on the one hand quite conceited, maybe even arrogant, but also he would have been exposed from infancy would have had all of the Brahmin teachings given to him. So that's why he could master them at the age of 16. So the Buddha turns to him and rebukes him and says, don't break in and interrupt us. Your elders are speaking, and just wait patiently until we finish our discussion. Okay, so when this is said, then the Brahmin Canki appeals or makes a polite request to the Buddha and says, please, Master Gautama, don't rebuke the Brahmin student Kappatika, for he is very learned, he has a good delivery, he is wise. I don't remember whether the word used is pandita, which means wise in the sense of learning, or panyava, which means one who has real wisdom. But he's capable of taking part in this discussion. Okay, it seems that the Buddha accepts this suggestion from Canki, and now the Brahmin student Kappatika thinks that he wants to catch the eye of the Buddha in order to ask him a question. since perhaps the Buddha is looking at the senior Brahmins, and maybe deliberately avoiding the eye of Kappatika because he knows that this youngster is a bit of a nuisance. But Kappatika, again, how do we know that Kappatika had this thought? It seems that the compilers are introducing what we call narrative elements into this to make it more coherent. But it says Kappatika it makes it interesting also to give a little dramatic content. Yeah, I have to make a request to those who have, are these cell phones that make this music? Okay, so the Buddha knows the thought in the student Kappatika's mind, and now the Buddha now wants to initiate the discussion. So the Buddha deliberately turns to him, the eyes meet, and then the Brahmin student takes this as an opening, as the opportunity for opening a conversation. So now he's going to, in a sense, sort of hit on a really key point, a key concern of the Brahmins, and that is the truth, the authority of the Vedas. And so he says, Master Gautama, in regard to the ancient Brahmin hymns that have come down through oral transmission, that are preserved in the collections, the Brahmins come to the definite conclusion that only this is true. Anything else is wrong. So by the ancient Brahmin hymns, he's referring to the hymns of the Vedas, particularly probably with special emphasis on the Rig Veda, which is the oldest and the most sacred of the Vedas. So what does Master Gautama say about this? Okay, now the Buddha here has to be tactful. He's surrounded by Brahmins, and this young Brahmin is asking him this kind of, call it explosive question, potentially explosive question. So if the Buddha were to say, that's just a blind belief on the part of the Brahmins, there'd be an uproar, and the Brahmins might get up angrily and all depart. So the Buddha is going to question Kappatika in a way which is going to get Kappatika to recognize the fault, so that Kappatika himself will recognize the fault, or we could say the pretentiousness, the illegitimacy of this claim of the Brahmins. And also by asking the questions in this way, the Buddha is going to open up the opportunity to present a distinction in means of knowledge, ways of knowing. In modern philosophy, we might call this the difference in epistemologies, the approaches to the acquisition of knowledge, or the difference in the approaches to acquisition of truth claims, since the truth claims might not be valid at all. So the Buddha questions Bharadvaja. He asks them, how then, among the Brahmins, is there even one Brahmin who says this about the Vedic hymns? I know this, I see this, only this is true, anything else is wrong. And Bharadvaja has to admit, no, Master Gautama. How then, Bharadvaja, among the Brahmins, is there even a single teacher or a single teacher's teacher going back through 7 generations who says, I know, I see this, only this is true, anything else is wrong. And now Bharadvaja is probably getting a little embarrassed and ashamed, since he probably sees what the Buddha is driving at. But he has to be honest in conversation, so he says, no, Master Gotama. Okay, now the Buddha takes the argument right back to the very beginning, so to speak, and he says, how then, Bharadvaja, the ancient Brahmin seers, the creators of the hymns, the composers of the hymns, the ones who in ancient times chanted, uttered, and compiled the hymns, and who have sent down these hymns in a line of transmission. Then he mentions the names, Attaka, Vamaka, Vamadeva, Vesamita, Yamatagi, Angirasa, Bharadvaja, Vaseta, Kassapa, and Bhagu. I believe that these would be rishis or sages who are mentioned in the Rig Veda. Did even these ancient Brahmin seers, and the word seer here is the word rishi, did they say, we know this, we see this, only this is true, anything else is wrong? I sometimes wonder what would happen if somewhere in this argument Bharadvaja were to say, well, there are Brahmins who do make this claim that this is true, anything else is wrong. But he complies with the drift of the Buddha's argument. Okay, so now the Buddha says, he sums up the points, he says, it seems then that among the Brahmins there is not even a single Brahmin who says, I know this, I see this, only this is true, anything else is wrong. And so there's not even a single teacher or teacher's teacher back through 7 generations who can make this claim. And even the very ancient Brahmin seers who created and passed down the hymns, even they couldn't make this claim. And now the Buddha brings in a very vivid simile to illustrate the point. He says, suppose there were a file of blind men, each in touch with the next. So they're holding on, each one is holding the hand of the one in front. And so the first one does not see, the middle one does not see, the last one does not see. And so too, in regard to their statements, the Brahmins seem to be like a file of blind men. The first one does not see, the middle one does not see, and the last one does not see. So, and now the Buddha draws out the conclusion. He says, since this is the case, doesn't the faith of the Brahmins turn out to be groundless? Oh, it's a very powerful point, since the Brahmins are in a sense staking everything on the belief, the faith that the words of the Vedas are infallible, revelations of truth. In fact, my understanding was that, or at least that this is the mainstream Hindu belief, is that the Vedas were not actually composed by human beings, or that they are not human creations, human compositions, but rather the ancient rishis were supposed to have received a kind of divine inspiration that the truth of the Vedas were breathed into the depths of their minds, and then through the force of the divine inspiration, they composed the Vedas. Okay, but since none of them make a claim to the truth of the Vedas, to know and see for themselves that the Vedas are truth, then any kind of truth claims about the Vedas, it doesn't mean that what the Vedas say are false, but the faith that what they say is true is groundless. Any questions or any comments about this? Please, go right ahead.
This is a comment. I think this is a very crucial logical statement of the Buddha.
Yeah.
Because the Brahmins, it came generations after generations. Sometimes they didn't write it purposely.
They didn't.
Write down the slokas purposely because they wanted to control and pass it on through ears only, through memorization.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So they have done this memorization like chanting of mantras.
Yeah.
Even now they do that.
Yeah.
But no one has the courage to tell, yes, I know this to be true. Yes, I heard it myself.
Yeah.
They did not. That is the truth.
Yeah.
And Buddha caught them at their own mistake.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. But also we have to remember, in the Buddha's time, religious teaching, spiritual teachings were always passed on orally. There was no writing used for, from the text, there seems to be no evidence that writing was used at that time. If it was used, it might have been used just if a king was issuing an edict, he would have the edict inscribed on stone, or maybe they would send messages. But in the Buddhist texts themselves, there's no mention of any text being written down. So all religious teachings were being transmitted orally at that time.
Yes, my other point is it was purposely done to control.
It was, I didn't get that word.
Purposely. It was
purposely
done to control, because they wanted to control the mantras, because this is their territorial power.
That I don't know about. I'm not so sure about that. Because it seems that there could have been a general conviction that
No, for example, the Gayatri mantra, the most important mantra in Hindu religion, they will only pass it on through your ears so that nobody else can hear it. Anyway, the other point is, that is why I think my knowledge is that Buddha taught in the local language, the Pali language. That's so anybody can hear it, and know it, and understand it.
Yeah, the Buddha would have taught in the local language, and he wanted the text to be preserved in the local language. Though the language that we call Pali now, the general consensus of scholars is that it's something of a amalgamation of a number of dialects that were used in northern India, perhaps about 2 centuries after the passing of the Buddha. That would have been closely related to the languages that the Buddha spoke. Any further comments, questions? Okay, then I think we will stop here and then take up the rest of the sutta next week. Originally I was intending to do the whole sutta this week according to the schedule. So now I've started the new semester by throwing off the printed schedule the very first class. But I thought it's rather interesting to go through that the 2 tables of arguments, or the 2 sets of arguments that are used. One, why the Buddha should come to see the brahmin Canki, and the other, why Canki's arguments, why he himself should go to see the Buddha. Okay, so we end with the sharing of the merits, and then after the lunch break, then we come back and say starting 12 o'clock, and we'll have maybe about 30 minutes discussion. So everybody has the sheet for the sharing of the merits. Okay, so we're sharing the merits with the Dhamma protecting devas, the nagas or dragon spirits, the bhutas, the fierce spirits, and with all beings, requesting them to protect the Buddha Sasana, to protect the exposition of the teaching, to protect the world, and to, by rejoicing, to achieve all of their good purposes. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sahasanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mam param. Etavata hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavagupadaya avichitato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha asanya sanino dukkha pamochantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, we stand up. And we end with 3 short bows to the Buddha.
How's the band?